The 1960s, New York State. In the northern part of New York comes a story about a mysterious figure that people have claimed to have witnessed from the mid-1960s until more recently in 2017. Described as a cryptic white blob with no eyes or mouth that hovers above the ground. Now, is this some type of ghost or spectre, or is it truly some type of creature that is an anomalous white blob known to the people of New York as the Kinderhook Blob? And also today on the show, we stay in New York State to investigate a Native American legend of a cannibalistic shadow figure stalking the woods of western New York. And perhaps the most notable feature is that this shadow figure is described as having a large black brimmed hat. Could this figure known as High Hat be related to the infamous shadow figure known as the Hat Man? Could there be a connection between High Hat and another Native American figure also donning a black hat? Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we explore a duo of cryptid stories from the state of New York, both on opposite sides of the monster spectrum. Today, we explore the stories of the Kinderhook Blob and High Hat. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and if you are listening to this show, first I want to say thank you. Thank you for checking out the show. Thank you for supporting my content, and I greatly appreciate it. If you're listening to this show on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. If you happen to be listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out with the algorithm gods, and I greatly appreciate it. Now, today on the show, I have decided to stay within the realm of cryptids, and I started kind of going through my never-ending list of topic suggestions for episodes that I kind of have all queued up on my phone, and I found the Kinderhook Blob, which is a very interesting story, because on paper, it seems like one of those stories that seems so incredibly outlandish. You just have to research it and look into it, and that it is hard to fully understand possibly seeing something like the Kinderhook Blob, and it honestly reminds me of the New Mill Green Blob that I think I covered all the way back on like the 6th ever episode here on the show. And however, the Kinderhook Blob differs as it doesn't just seem like a orb of gunk, but rather a physical object and a physical creature, and that to me is just as equally strange as it is intriguing. Now, while doing my research for the Kinderhook Blob, I discovered that this episode would be pretty short if I just covered the blob alone, so I started looking for some other small stories that I could include in this week's episode, and I found the story of High Hat, and it is just a total coincidence that both of these creatures hail from New York State, because now it puts me in a little bit of a bind if I ever decide to do a Cryptids Across America episode over New York, because I just took two very worthy candidates and made their own episode about them already, but maybe I will cross that bridge when I get there. However, today's episode is going to, and how it's going to go, is that we're first going to explore these two topics I have for you today, explain the backstory and sightings of these creatures, of these beings, and then go into any other additional facts that I was able to find in my research, and then give you my personal thoughts and theories on both of the topics we have for today's episode, and discuss whether or not I think that there is some merit behind these creatures existing, or maybe if they are just products of overactive human imaginations. But with all that being said, let's first dive into the story of the Kinderhook Blob. Now, the story of the Kinderhook Blob begins with a boy named Bruce Hallenbeck in 1962. Now, from 1962 to 2017, you had 3 separate sightings witnessed by 6 different people, and while these sightings have a wide date range for when these sightings took place, the descriptions remain roughly consistent, and this is notable because of that wide range of years that these sightings do take place over. In 1962, Bruce Hallenbeck, who was 10 at the time of the sighting, would be playing outside in the woods near his home in Kinderhook with his cousin Sherry. Bruce states that while he and his cousin were playing outside, they would hear this very loud pitched whistle noise This, of course, would catch the two kids off guard, and they would start looking around to where the source of the sound came from. Now, as they looked around the area, something would catch their attention out of the corner of their eye. What they would see is what they would describe as a solid white object with no discernible facial features, and Bruce noted that it appeared to be watching them, but had no eyes to do so. Rightfully terrified about what this was, the two children ran back to Bruce's home as fast as they possibly could. Now, this is obviously the very first sighting of the Kinderhook Blob, and it seems to be the most notable of all of them. And like I said, the blob is described as being all white in color, with of course no discernible facial features, no eyes, no mouth, no nose, anything like that, and seemingly no arms or legs either, just kind of this kind of white blob of mass. Perhaps the most notable of the illustrations done of the Kinderhook Blob kind of gives it this, these little stubby arms. I don't know if whether or not that's truly the case or whether that's truly what the kids saw that day. However, from all of my understanding and what I was able to find is, again, they basically describe it as this giant white blob that looked to be watching the kids, but like I said, it had no eyes to do so. And Bruce said it was giving the impression of like it was doing so. Now, it would not be until 2 years later, in 1964, a man would be hiking through the woods near Kinderhook and would state that a white blob-shaped figure would appear from the woods and start to pursue him. The man would describe the blob much like in the first encounter. However, he would state that the blob was floating and not physically on the ground like it seemed it was in the first sighting from Bruce Hallenbeck. The man was eventually able to flee after clearing a large patch of water to try and get away from the blob. Later, the man would return with a friend, armed with a pitchfork and a shovel, to try and find the creature that originally chased him in the woods. Now, on first glance, these two men, they started looking around, trying to see if they could find the blob, and they didn't see anything. That was until they looked up into the treetops of the forest and saw the white blob floating within the treetops. The men would reportedly be so terrified they would drop their garden supplies, turn defense weapons, and make a break for it out of the woods as fast as they could. Now, later in 1978, although the year of this sighting is debated, Barry Scott and Russell Lee, both 14 years old, would be camping out in the woods outside of Kinderhook, and while camping they would hear a sound come from outside of their tent that would almost sound like a trampling noise on the brush and the leaves outside of the tent and outside in the forest. They would become curious about what this noise was, what was causing this noise, and thinking, some type of animal could be outside of their tent, and they wanted to see what was out there. Upon opening up the tent, the two boys would observe a floating blob-like figure outside. This figure would closely resemble that of a ghost, described with a almost flowing white sheet-like appearance, and was also described as being like a bell shape in appearance. However, the blob was seemingly making noises beneath it, like it was physically walking, even though it was floating. Now, this does seem to be a little bit of an outlier of the sightings, as Scott and Lee state they saw something that would more closely resemble maybe a prototypical ghost than maybe a white blob with no discernible features. Now, the two teens varied their descriptions, with one opting the approach that it looked more like a floating white bell, like I just mentioned, and the other boy thinking it looked more like the Virgin Mary, actually. Then, in 2017, another sighting would take place. Owen Farley and Anthony Malinowski would be out at night in the woods around Kinderhook when they would hear a very large, high-pitched scream, and they would observe a figure described as a white blob emerge in front of them. They would take this as their cue to run for the hills, and they did just that. Now, these would be the three sightings that we have of the Kinderhook Blob, or bear in mind, I guess, 4 sightings. And although the descriptions of the Kinderhook Blob are similar, they also kind of vary a little bit. They are a little bit different, and this does make me question whether or not maybe all of these sightings are maybe seeing the same thing, or maybe different variations of the same thing, or whatever it may be. Either way, we don't have a ton to go off of here. However, in my research, I was able to find a Reddit post from a user who claims to have had a sighting of the Kinderhook Blob, or what they think is the Kinderhook Blob, in a nearby town in New York. Now, it is a little bit on the longer side, but I did want to read it all for you, so stay with me. Now, the following is from that Reddit post of the supposed sighting that would take place in February of 2017, and it seems to be completely separate from the other 2017 sighting, as this involves just the one person, the original poster, having the sighting in this Reddit post. Now, the following is the post in its entirety, and like I said, it is a little bit on the long side, but I did want to read it for you all today. Now, the following is the post, and I quote, "So before I tell you my encounter, I made a post yesterday on r/Hudson Valley where I talked about my paranormal experience, and people in the comments recommended me to talk about it here on this subreddit. So here I am. Feel free to check out my post on the Hudson Valley subreddit if you want to. But on this post, I'm definitely going to be talking about it in much more detail. After addressing that, let's get straight into my story. So it was around February of 2017. I was 15 and had a dry throat at the time. For that year, I wanted to build a shed in the middle of the woods of my backyard, mainly to just hang out in. As for a fun project to do in the summer months, so on a cold, dry, windy, but yet sunny day, probably around noonish or late morning, I started on a hike alone in the woods of my backyard to begin to find a spot to put down this shed on. The shape and the geography of the section of the property that has the woods is weird. The woods part of the property pokes out like the Oklahoma Panhandle, and to get to the deepest woods of my property, where I wanted to build the shed, you must walk up a hill, and then that hill eventually plateaus. Also, that hill is easily the tallest of it in the general area, and on the day my encounter happened, I was to see hundreds, if not thousands of feet, especially since there were no leaves on the trees. All in all, it is a 2-minute hike, and in the woods you can see things like rusty barrels and metal fences. Mainly because back in the day, my backyard woods was a popular hunting spot, which is evident with the rusty metal barrels and the beer cans I found dating back to the 1980s once. But yeah, I hike up through the property and I make it to the plateau hill part. Also note, there was someone's house probably a little over 100 feet from where I was. I had a pretty good viewpoint to their entire property. And then there was a barn in someone's house quite far from where I was, but definitely seeable. So for a couple minutes, I started looking for good spots to put this shed. I eventually picked one and started imagining how I should build the shed. I wanted to start from scratch. While I was doing this, I started to hear a 5-note whistle song way in the distance. Now, I'm not a musician, but I'm going to try my best to describe it. It was 2 notes, were long, flat notes, with a short break in between the 2, and then the next one. Then followed by a higher pitch swinging up note, and then quickly a normal swinging note. Then back to a long flat note with a higher pitch than the first 2. And whoever was whistling kept repeating it. I looked around for a couple seconds to see if I could find whoever was whistling. It sounded like it was coming deeper into the woods, way downhill, but I didn't see anyone. I also checked the house and barn if I could see anyone, and sure enough, there was no one. What I also thought was strange is that I didn't hear rustling of leaves either. The whole woods was covered in them, and rustling of leaves is loud and could easily give away your location. But there wasn't any rustling. I immediately ignored it as probably one of my neighbors or something. Also, please note that the whistling was definitely not an animal, and rather a human. Birds have a chirp-like whistle, but this whistling is more breathy, like a human. So, I went back to my spot, content that it was a person walking in the woods. After all, that is a pretty logical conclusion. But the whistling kept getting closer and louder, still playing the same 5 notes too. And still, there was no one to be seen and no rustling of leaves to be heard. I was very stubborn that it wasn't paranormal and that this has to be a person, despite the fact that whatever is whistling is coming towards and still no clue of who or what is whistling to me. The whistling was going on for well over a minute now, and eventually the whistling sounded so close to me that it felt like it was someone quite literally whistling to me 5 feet away. It sounded like the whistling was also coming from all directions, so now I started to get a little spooked. I then concluded that whatever this whistling is could be a threat, so I started making my way back to the house, a 2-minute hike. One thing that I forgot to bring up on the Hudson Valley post is that I didn't run out of there or anything. I just walked back home. I was kind of spooked, but not terrified or anything. I also felt like if I ran, then whatever was whistling at me would pop out and chase me. So I walked and stayed calm to keep whatever it was at a stalking/taunting phase. Because it sure did feel like whatever was whistling at me was definitely stalking and taunting me. Now, I have to be real with you. This next part of my experience felt quite trance-like, so I could have just hallucinated this part as well as the whistling, and I've had sleep paralysis episodes several times in my life, and plus when I'm really tired, I do hallucinate things time to time, but I definitely wasn't tired at the time, nor have I ever had a hallucination episode this big and long ever. All of my tired hallucination and sleep paralysis episodes last from a fraction of a second to several seconds. So if this was a hallucination, this would be by far craziest one I've ever had. So back to my story. I'm about a minute away from making it to my backyard of my house, still hearing the whistling and such, and I decided to look up, and there it was. Something that was all gray, blurry, no face and features. Humanoid-like thing was flying above me counterclockwise. It could have been maybe around 5 to 6 feet in height and had a wingspan around the same. The thing had the silhouette of a person with a head, 2 arms, torso, and legs, kind of looking like a T with a circle on top acting as the head. I still trusted my gut, and instead of running, I kept walking, despite the threats, it keeping me safe for this long, so might as well keep doing that. Then finally, I took one step into the grass of my own backyard, and suddenly everything weird stops. Now, more whistling, flying thing, or a feeling of being in a trance. I remembered smelling roses, though, like it was peaceful. After that experience, I didn't want to build a shed in the woods anymore, LOL. And for years, even a little bit to this day, I hate being near those backyard woods by myself. The reason why it took me a long time to talk about this story is because I ruled it as a paranormal ghost encounter. And the great thing is possibly an angel for years, but it wasn't until a few months ago I was reading some cryptid wikis and heard about the Kinderhook Blob monster. And there was a bunch of similarities between my encounter and the blob sightings. First, I don't live a crazy far from Kinderhook. I could have easily taken a drive over there. 2, the thing I saw was kind of blob-like, and one sighting even described it as humanoid, plus it was one whole color and no face, like the blob. And finally, 3, it whistles and flies, which could help explain why I couldn't find anything in the woods, because it was flying above near the trees, which, to be honest, that is kind of funny how oblivious I was to that. And, well, yeah, I definitely heard some whistling. So, what do you guys think? Do you have any realistic or paranormal answers you would like to address? Let me know. Now, I do apologize. The original post has kind of a little bit of broken English there, and you kind of heard me kind of stop and pause, as there were certain periods in that story where it was broken English, and I kind of had to collect my thoughts there. So I do apologize, but that's copy and paste exactly what the original Reddit post said. So I do apologize if that was a little hard to understand at times, but I hope you got the overall gist of that story from that Reddit poster. Now, I do like this story because it does bear some similarities to the original sightings of the Kinderhook Blob, while seemingly also being influenced by the later sightings where the creature was described to be floating rather than walking. But the Reddit story itself does seem different because the OP would describe that this figure, while featureless, had appendages. It had a head and a wingspan instead of just being kind of a shapeless blob or kind of this floating figure. In my opinion, this sighting might be another outlier, but I think it is overall hard to say. With the Hallenbeck encounter, it seems like the most blobbish of a shape that we have, and that the blob was hidden behind a tree. So obviously, Bruce Hallenbeck couldn't get the entire gist of what this creature, what this figure looked like. But it does seem like there's some inconsistency with the sighting. Some consistency, some inconsistency. This is the only sighting that we have, or supposed sighting that we have. We take everything with a grain of salt, especially if it's posted on Reddit. We'll take it with a grain of salt. But, this is the only sighting where there's any kind of appendages that are quoted to have been sighted. Obviously, the Hallenbeck encounter does describe a whistling noise. You have the other sightings that say that there was a scream noise. This sighting has a whistling noise. This creature obviously flies. So there's a lot of, like I said, consistencies, some inconsistencies, but overall, we have a fairly consistent idea of what this figure, what this creature, whatever it may be, is. And I think that gives us an idea of kind of what we're kind of looking at, whether or not this is some type of monster or cryptid or whatever you might have it, or whether or not this is some type of kind of paranormal entity. But with that kind of out of the way, and with all of our sightings, and with that kind of Reddit story that I was able to find and include within the episode, let's talk about some theories about the Kinderhook Blob. Now, the first theory I want to talk about is the blob/shmoo theory, and let me explain what I mean here. Our first theory is that this creature is truly some type of amalgamous blob-like being. Now, if this is skeptical to you, I completely understand. However, this is not the first time a creature or being like this has been sighted. Of course, we talked a little bit earlier about the Newmill green blob, which I believe took place over in the UK. There's another case of a sighting in Medford, Oregon. Now, the Medford Shmoos, if they've been, which is probably a top 5 cryptid name, or whatever you want to call it, a top 5 name of all time, the Medford Shmoos. The Medford Shmoos, as they have come to be called, that sighting took place in the summer of 1953, where a family of 3 witnessed 3 strange blob-like figures covered in white satin-like fur. Now, these 3 blob-like creatures, I guess, had no visible features like heads, arms, or legs, and the 3 blobs were just gliding through the air with no visible wings or means of propulsion. This family would watch these creatures for a short time period before they would then disappear into the forest. The creatures getting their Shmoo name from the Little Abner comic strip. Now, while there are some similarities between the Medford Shmoos and the Kinderhook Blob, they pretty much stop at the idea of the object being white and featureless, but the shape, the overall description, that's a little bit different. The Medford Shmoos were considerably smaller. I believe they were only roughly 3 feet across, and of course there was 3 of them, but only being about 3 feet across, whereas the Kinderhook Blob is described as being much bigger than that, 5 to 6. I even saw 7 feet floated out there at one point. But overall, the Kinderhook Blob is much bigger than the Medford Shmoos. And the other part that takes into account here is that the Shmoos sighting happened all the way across the country in Oregon. So this is on a whole different other side of the United States from Kinderhook. Now, overall, I don't know if I necessarily love the blob theory, and I think I just need some evidence that maybe this thing is some type of physical creature. And so far, judging by the sightings that we do have, and I would say evidence, or lack thereof, I don't know necessarily if I want to say that this is just some kind of amalgamous blob-like creature that we just fully don't understand yet. Now, the second theory is the ghost theory, and the ghost theory makes a lot of sense. The first sighting by Bruce Hallenbeck makes this seem like a physical entity, but the other sightings where this figure is floating and moving through the air, and even the sighting describing it as bell-shaped and almost kind of flowing, and the other man saying that it had the other boy, I should say, saying that it had an almost Virgin Mary-esque look to it because of how the object was flowing, like it was wearing a sheet or a dress of some sort. Now, again, the ghost theory seems to cover a lot of our bases here, and this made me want to do some more research into Kinderhook and to try and find some backstory to the ghost theory and what could work. And what I found was that Kinderhook is a deeply haunted and spiritual place and has numerous ties to the paranormal. As it turns out, Kinderhook is tied directly to the legend of Sleepy Hollow, where the author, Washington Irving, got his inspiration for the novel from the town of Kinderhook and local resident Jesse Merwin. Now, the town has numerous spooky places, like the Kinderhook Cemetery, where Merwin and even former President Martin Van Buren is buried, as well as Merwin's home, where people have reported encounters with a spirit known as the Heavy Breather. Now, while the ghost theory doesn't check all the boxes, it certainly checks most of them. And so far, I would say that is our most valid contender as to what the Kinderhook Blob really is. Now, our next theory is that this could be some type of animal, or some type of misidentified animal, and while I doubt this with the later sightings, because the witnesses, and multiple witnesses, mind you, got really good looks at the object in question, and its kind of overall description, and it flying and floating and things like that, this makes me doubt that someone could mistake a floating white object for some type of animal. However, in the very first sighting by Bruce Hallenbeck and his cousin Sherry, seeing just a white shape against a tree, more or less, could be explained by an albino bear. Now, they did report that the object did not have any discernible features, and while a bear against a tree would have features you'd be able to recognize, maybe you would not be able to recognize them as much if the bear actually had its back towards you and was scratching up against the tree. Now, sometimes referred to as spirit bears because of their significance to Native American populations, albino black bears are rare, but they do happen and are sighted. We've gotten plenty of photographs of them before, so it would not be unheard of that perhaps this could have been an albino black bear that was scratching his back against the tree. Now, this would of course give the appearance of some type of white blob kind of peeking and bobbing back and forth in between the trees. Now, while it doesn't fully match up, I don't think really anything is truly going to match up to what is described of the Kinderhook Blob. Now, in my personal theory, I think the Kinderhook Blob is some type of ghost or some type of spirit. And obviously it seems like the Kinderhook Blob in this instance is more physical in nature. Of course, I'm not a foremost expert in anything paranormal. I'm probably the farthest from it. I'm just a guy with a microphone and a passion of talking about things. But to me, it seems like the descriptions of the Kinderhook Blob, it does give that stereotypical kind of ghost-like appearance, kind of bell-shaped, flowing, floating in between the trees. Obviously, Kinderhook is a deeply haunted place, a deeply spiritual place, has a extensive history with the paranormal from everything that I researched. So to me, this matches up the best. Now, could there be some type of historical significance? Could the Kinderhook Blob be the ghost of, some type of former resident of Kinderhook that maybe have passed away in the forest or whatever it may be, and now the blob or this ghost now haunts the forest for whatever reasons? I certainly think so. However, it does not, I don't believe anything fully addresses what the Kinderhook Blob might truly be, but I think the ghost theory fits as much as we possibly can, and for that reason, I'm going to go with the idea that the Kinderhook Blob is some type of ghost-like figure. Now, with the Kinderhook Blob story out of the way, let's talk about the other story on today's episode of Hi-Hat. Now, Hi-Hat, who kind of seems like he has kind of a cool name, but also kind of goofy to say out loud, Hi-Hat. Hi-Hat is a creature steeped mainly in legend, and from what I could find, I could not actually find any documented sightings of this strange figure, rather kind of, like I said, legend and folklore. However, what stands out to me about this Hi-Hat legend is not the legend itself per se, but rather how much Hi-Hat bears a startling resemblance to the Hat Man, a figure commonly associated with sleep paralysis and the overdosing of Benadryl medication. The descriptions are extremely similar. Even more startling to me is that there was another figure from Native American folklore from South Dakota called Walking Sam, who was described as a tall black silhouette of a man wearing a large flat-brimmed hat. A near-identical description to both Hi-Hat and the Hat Man. It makes us ask the larger question of what is this phenomenon in general? What is responsible for the sightings and documentation of these shadowy figures with large, basically stovepipe hats? What is the significance behind them? And that perhaps is a question even myself can't answer, but we can explore the Hi-Hat legend and its origins, and then discuss its counterpart in Walking Sam, and maybe talk about a few theories here. Now, Hi-Hat in his origin is traced to the Allegheny Native American Reservation in southwestern New York. The existence of this figure is widely talked about amongst the town of Salamanca in the reservation, but also amongst Native American storytellers like Dwayne Deuce Bowen, a fairly well-known Seneca storyteller. Now, Hi-Hat is described as a large, towering, shadowy figure that is described as having rows of sharp teeth within its mouth and being cannibalistic in nature and eating children. The name Hi-Hat being derived from the descriptions of this figure being described as having a large stovepipe hat that many described as being similar to that of former President Abraham Lincoln's hat. Now, according to the folklore surrounding this figure or creature, or whatever you want to call it, that during the construction of the Kinzua Reservoir in the area during the early 1960s to 1965 time period, saw an increased awareness of the figure was often seen around the banks of the northern shore of the reservoir. This was because of the construction of the reservoir brought in a lot of outsiders to the reservation and, of course, non-reservation living peoples, and they would start to see this figure and start to hear the stories being told about it throughout the local communities. Eventually, the sightings became so common that many of these construction workers would ask amongst themselves whether or not they had seen Abe Lincoln today, remarking if anybody had seen Hi Hat yet that shift. Now, like I said, I could not find any specific sightings of this figure, and most of the story lives in this kind of folkloric space. However, like I just mentioned, I am curious about the connection Hi Hat possibly has with Walking Sam, another figure described as virtually identical, and being identical of the same creature, just in a different portion of the country. Now, let's go from southwestern New York to Pine Ridge, South Dakota. Now, in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, resides a major Lakota Native American reservation. However, Pine Ridge has some problems. It is a very poor area of the country. Homelessness is a huge problem, and suicide rates in the community are high. Out of these real-world issues within the Pine Ridge community is a legend of Walking Sam, a tall, slender humanoid entity donning a black stovepipe hat who supposedly pressures young people to commit suicide, and that Walking Sam carries the souls of those who do. In 2015, the Pine Ridge community was gripped with a rash of teen and young adult suicides. There were 103 attempts from people trying to take their own life between December of 2014 and March of 2015, and only 9 of them were successful, all by hanging. And all of these young people who had taken their own lives, they were all under the age of 25. Now, the Lakota people are believed to have suicide spirits and shadowy stick people who try to lure young children away from their homes in the middle of the night, and Walking Sam is just one such example. Now, while Walking Sam again seems to live in this realm of folklore rather than perhaps a tangible figure, it does ask the question of perhaps the human mind, and why we often associate perhaps childhood or mental trauma with shadow people in general, and why do they all wear hats? Is this just a way to help our brain associate and characterize different figures? Now, it does make you ask those very questions, and why perhaps 2 different Native American tribes have nearly identical legends of hat-wearing spirits that seek harm against children and the young. Now, you could associate these legends with the prototypical stories of the boogeyman, and parents not wanting their children to be alone in the middle of a vast expanse of forest and wilderness. Now, perhaps this could be the case of spirits having a very firm hold on Native American beliefs, and thus the belief that shadow people and shadow figures are tangible and bend the laws of traditional belief. Whether or not you believe shadow people are spirits or perhaps wanderers from another plane of existence, the legends of figures such as Hi Hat, Walking Sam, and even the Hat Man question our understanding as to what we truly know, and again, why they seemingly all wear hats. However, like I mentioned before, this quite possibly is a question that I cannot begin to answer or even propose a theory to on my own, because my knowledge when it comes to shadow people and spirituality and even the paranormal and the ties it has with the human mind is extremely slim. However, if somebody does want to educate me and all that stuff, I am more than willing to learn, because I genuinely think something is going on here. I think it's something bigger. Maybe it is some type of connection with the human mind. And honestly, if you ask my theory immediately about what, Hi Hat is, or what Walking Sam is, or even the Hat Man, I do think that there's some larger connection, maybe a spiritual connection, paranormal connection, whatever it may be, between these 3 figures. There must be something connecting them, because I feel like a large stovepipe hat is a very specific item of clothing to wear, especially considering that is the most tangible feature out of the figure, despite the fact that it's just kind of a shadowy humanoid figure. So I do think there's something larger going on. Whether or not I have any other theories besides this being some type of maybe paranormal entity, or maybe your brain playing tricks on you, something along those lines, I am more along the lines to believe that this is some type of paranormal entity that, again, maybe our brain connects and associates with other shadow figures. I'm not too quite sure. But again, if somebody does want to educate me more about this topic, I absolutely want to, or absolutely be my guest. Feel free to leave it down in the comments section, things like that. I really don't know what's going on here. I can't really begin to wrap my brain around it, but I do think there's something larger going on here when it comes to shadow people, and maybe I do a whole episode sometime in the future just on shadow people, and I take a huge deep dive into that. I mean, it's often hard for me, when I go through week to week of putting out episodes and things like that, to dive into an entire genre of things because there's just so much information. So I often find myself in like the week to week monotony of it all, of finding a topic, staying within the realm of that topic, and finding as much information as I can, and then writing scripts and editing and all that other fun stuff. And I don't really have myself dedicating enough time to, like I said, diving into kind of a whole subgenre of maybe shadow figures as a whole and things of that nature. So I definitely want to do that sometime in the future. So maybe I will do an episode sometime over just shadow people, because we've done, obviously, the Hat Man, we've done the Dark Watchers over in California. We've talked about shadow people, I believe, a few times here on the show. So maybe I should do, like I said, a whole episode on that eventually. But with that being said, I believe that's going to do it for this week's episode of Unblurring the Unknown over the Kinderhook Blob and the Hat Man, two creatures or cryptids, if you want to call them, who kind of teeter the line of being maybe tangible or maybe being creatures that exist within the paranormal space. But with that being said, that is going to do it for me on this week of Unblurring the Unknown. I do very much appreciate the support. I appreciate everybody who checks out and listens to the show and everything like that. Again, I cannot thank you enough, and I appreciate it. I'm rapidly approaching episode 100, which is a huge milestone for me. I'm trying to stay up to date as much as I can on my other social medias, Instagram and TikTok at the same handle, Unblurring the Unknown. So feel free to check me out there if you haven't yet. I'm trying to stay as active as possible on my other social media fronts, while I'll also trying to juggle, full-time career and, writing scripts and editing and everything like that, while also, trying to make time for family and significant others and everything like that. It is a whirlwind. Life is often a whirlwind, and you got to take time every now and again to take care of yourself. And I do want to say that. Take care of yourself and everything like that. And don't be afraid to reach out if you ever need help, everything like that. People are there to support you. People are there to help you, myself included. I'm always a resource to help people. That's a big belief of mine, a big belief system of myself. And yeah. But with that all being said, like I said, I try to juggle as much as I can. But again, approaching episode 100, I keep getting sidetracked here. I hope to eventually, once I reach episode 100, I still got to figure out what the topic of that episode is going to be, but I hope that it is a very good one, very significant milestone for me. But I do plan on taking some time off following episode 100, so I can kind of maybe experiment with a couple new things for the show, maybe experiment with kind of getting ahead on some early scripts for some more episodes and things like that. So once episode 100 does hit, I plan on taking a brief hiatus to kind of collect my thoughts, maybe do some scripts, like I said, mess around with some other stuff for the show and the future of the show. But yeah, so I appreciate the support. I appreciate everything. And again, that is going to do it for this week's episode. And I greatly appreciate all of the support, and I will see you all on the next one.